Okay, so now for the next code along, let's actually take what we created hard-coded, the tables into the HTML, and actually write code to create that heading. Okay, so that's the part we'll focus on this one. So back over in the code in VS Code. So where I would start this work, okay, is I'd go into my event listener and I would think about where in this process would I want to render, right? And that's the word you'd want to think about, because what you're rendering now, by the way, this display output is actually also rendering, and this is why I call it this to start, because I want to introduce some concepts along the way. But in reality, what we really want to do is, and this would be a function call, render TBL, okay? Render the table. And in this case, I'm calling a function. Now, I haven't written the function yet. I'm just placing it here so that I know, yep, that's what I need to do. Now, just doing this, if I was to run my code, would create an error because I have to come up here, right, and do a function, right, render. And by the way, notice how it already sees, VS Code already sees, or giving me hints that I need something here. Now in this case, because I want to possibly use this in the future for other rendering, one thing I'm going to do, and this is a term, abstraction, that I probably have used before, but I'm going to use it again, because right now my global array of objects, right, is called let me come back down here. In here, right, the CFP data. But when I actually pass that array reference into here, I'm going to just call it data. It's still the same thing, but inside this block now it's referred to as just data. Okay. So the thing I'm going to want to do, and that's why I keep this open over here, my index file, so I can kind of look at it. So in code, right, I want to create a table, and in that table I want to create this part of the output. Okay, so I would look at this and I would go, okay, I want to create elements for each of these things, and then I'd want to think about how I'd want to do this, you know, multiple times, because as we see, we need to do 5 different headings. So I would start with setting up a const, and I'd call it table. Now in this case, I like to, when possible, call things what they are, so later when I'm reading it, I can say, okay, I'm going to create an element, I'm going to create the element table, then I'm actually going to reference, declare a variable that is the table. Okay, and then const t head equal document.create element, right, t head. Again, what I'm doing here is I'm just going through and building up each of these, making sure I'm using the right syntax. So now I've created a table, I've created a table heading, and now I want to do a tr, right here, the row. Okay, so the tr shouldn't be a big surprise. Okay, all right, so now I have my 3 structures. I have the table outside, nested inside, and now I have the TR. And so now I want to think about how I would handle this. And anytime in coding that you're going to do the same thing over and over again, you automatically want to think about a loop. Okay, so I'm going to show you a different kind of loop today, which is called a for loop. And I know Daniel has showed them in his code, and they're really handy. They're basically, you've learned how to do 2 kinds of loops so far, so we're just going to add a third, but there's some additional nice functionality that you'll see in this one. So the first thing I would do is I would set up, right, a heading text. I could call it that just to, right, but if I'm doing strictly camel case, I'd probably do it that, right? So I'm going to set up, and this is going to be an array. Okay, now why am I going to do this? And I'll try to talk as I'm doing it. Oh, see what happens when I try to talk and code. Okay, So what I want to have here is each heading. Okay. So hopefully you're typing along. I'm actually going to use no spaces on that one. Again, keep in mind, why am I doing it? And actually here I'm just going to do, and then actions. Okay. So now that I have each of those headings in an array, I can now iterate over that array. Oh, and actually what I should do here is actually call it. Okay. Because what you want to do is call things what they are when possible. Because then when somebody's reading your code, they're like, oh, heading text array. Oh, okay, kind of makes sense. So now here's your new for loop, or sorry, your new loop, and it's called for each. Okay, let's actually just quickly mdn for each. Okay, I'll provide this link because I think it's good to check it out. Now, this example of a for each is actually done with what we call a shortened syntax, an arrow syntax, but it's still, and I'm going to write it in the way we've been writing functions, but I probably need to go ahead and introduce that soon because it's a very common practice that we see using this shorthand, and there's only a couple of downsides to using it. Okay, so we reference the array for each, and so for each element, and in this case, this is, you name this whatever you want. For each element, in this case that's the way I'd read it, or for each item in the array, in this case it's console logging it. Okay, so but what happens here, and we've heard this term before, is on the for each on each item you're going to actually have a function. And so before, when we were doing the for of, it was just iterating over, or the for or just the for loop itself. You could have had an embedded function, but in this case, this is set up to allow that callback feature that says, okay, when I iterate over, when I loop over, each time I'm going to do this function. Okay, so let's actually write it. So what you do is first start with your array dot for each. Okay, open close parentheses. Then you would do function. Okay, and then your typical function signature. Okay, so that first is just the signature itself. So now the question is, what do you call each time it iterates over this, right? Well, of course, you could just call it text. That would make sense to me, okay? And if you want to make sure that your loop is working, then go in and console log out, right, each of them. But remember, again, where are we writing this code? Where are we calling this code from? You're calling it from your event listener. So until you actually enter some data, okay, you don't actually get the benefit of looking at your console.logs. So keep that in mind, okay? And notice how we're still getting the output from the display and the hard-coded. So I'd probably, matter of fact, I'd do this right now. I'd probably do this one for a minute, just take that one out. And then in a minute, when we get closer, I'll probably also comment this one out, and then we'll eventually get rid of them just so they don't show up in the output. Okay, so far, hopefully so good. Again, it's really good to test as you write. That way you're not waiting until the end and trying to figure out why you're getting errors. Okay, so now that we have each of them, now the question is, what do we want to do? Because we want to build up, oh, actually, my bad. No, the TR is right. That's right, TR. So now what we want to do is do a TH. So inside the loop, we'd set up a TH equal to document.createElement, right? TH. So we're creating the heading. Now what do we want the heading to have would be, so now take that heading, its text content, okay, is going to be equal to text. Okay, so we're updating each one as we're looping through, but as we update it, we also want to update the TR, okay? And in updating the TR, we really use what we've used before, in this case, because we're creating a DOM structure that we call these nodes as well. We would say TR dot append child Okay, and what are we appending as the TH? Okay, so think about that for a minute as you look at it. So we're creating, right? We're looping over. Every time we create a new TH here, then we're appending it each time. Okay, now we're not updating the DOM yet. As a matter of fact, it's kind of cool at this point to actually console.log your TR or your TH. And I'm going to do that because I really recommend you do this, because until you start to see that, notice what happens. So each one, now we can see that that structure is created the way we want it, but we haven't updated. This is all just to confirm, right? Let's actually come here, and I'm going to control forward so that you can see that the structure we've created, right, through code has not been updated on the DOM, but it has been created. So we've created the TRs, but nothing has happened on the DOM. So just keep that in mind. That's part of what we're learning in this section is how to render DOM, document object model, what we also call the web page, through our code. Okay, so now that we're through that iteration stack right there, now we're going to think about how do we add it, right? What do we add it to? We want to add that structure, right? That TR now back to the thread, the T head. Okay, so now we reference T head because now that we're through the loop, dot append child. Now, by the way, the difference between append and append child, append child typically works at a node level, and all that structure I was showing you on the concept is, or on the console, is node level stuff. You can just append, and it'll append text as well. But most of the time, what we're doing here is updating the DOM, although there could be a reason to do something different. So what are we updating, right? Well, we're going to append, the head with the TRs. Again, right? If you want, go and look at it. It's a good thing to look at, okay, to know that. And now what's the last thing we need to do? Now we need to append it to the table itself, right? So now we go table dot. Now append, oh, actually no. So let's do append child, right? T thread, T head. I don't call it thread on. I guess it looks like thread. So now we do have the whole table itself, right? Okay. Good. So now this is good to see. We've created this whole structure through our code and not hard-coded it in the program or in the HTML. And this is really when we're writing JavaScript the way we want to do things most of the time because we want the flexibility. But what's the last thing we need to do is we actually need to now update it on the page. Okay, and this is where I'd come over to my HTML. I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to do div ID equal, because I want to create a place on my HTML here. Okay, I'm going to call this tabular data, right? Tab.data, tab-data. Remember, when we're using an ID and we want to reference this, I do like to set up these constant, and I'm going to call it TBL, document.get element by ID. Again, there's if you're just going after one ID like we are here, it's better to use ID because it's more efficient than doing query selector, which we will see query selector soon. Query selector would then look for all the elements that match your particular query, but in this case it goes directly at, so tab-data. Okay, so I have now a reference to that. So what would I need to do here? So now that I have in my function, right, I know I have my table. I don't no longer need that. What's the last thing I need to do is I actually need to do tbl dot append child what? Table. Okay, so if we've done this right, then what happens here, right? Great. Okay, that's awesome. So now what we know is we can both create the structure and update the DOM. Remember, this is the line that actually updates the DOM. When I talk about it being expensive, why we wouldn't want to do that until here is that these append childs are just appending that structure. But when you're actually going on the web page, you want to try to somewhat limit the amount and where you would do that. Like when we did it before in the display, notice, and I said this at the time, this is expensive because you're updating that output 3 times. And really, again, part of what you're learning is the code. Part of what we want to help you understand is how to write good JavaScript. Okay. Okay, so now, last thing I'm going to have you do is it's a code challenge. Okay. So I want you to think about this because this is getting rather long, right? And we have a lot more to do, as we saw, right? We still have the body, we still have all of this. So if this is getting long, what would you do to it? Right? So I want you to, at this point, and I'll put this in the write-up. I'm gonna actually I'm gonna go ahead and stop this one. We're at about 16 minutes. And I want you to think about, because we have a lot more code that needs to go here. What would you do? We have a function, right? We have a lot of code that happens. So what would you do? Because what you want is you want your functions to be relatively straightforward. They don't have to necessarily be short, but really only doing one particular thing. And we've written the code for a particular part of what we're doing. So what would you do in this case to make this code more manageable over time? Stop, that's your challenge, and then come back on the next one and I'll show you my solution.